Our Bible study for this week is going to come from Numbers chapter 20. If you haven't already printed off a paper online that has our questions on it, I hope you'll take some time and do that. And kind of go over the questions beforehand and read them and study them and fill them out. Certainly helps me whenever I do that. And I imagine it'd be beneficial for all of us too. In Numbers chapter 20, though, we're going to talk about a couple of different things tonight. If you look on your handout sheet, the first two questions that we have deal with some of the subjects that we're going to be covering tonight. Your first question on that sheet is, what makes people look foolish whenever they're angry? And probably all of us have been in a situation or two where we let our anger get the best of us. And generally when that happens, sometimes we say things that we shouldn't say. And so we speak before we really think about the consequences of our words. You know, how is somebody going to react to this if we say it? What are going to be the consequences of it? You know, entire wars have been started and fought simply because of words, angry words that were spoken in the beginning. And so when we let our anger get the best of us, we do look foolish because we say things without really thinking about the consequences of what's being said. And we also act many times out of anger. And a lot of times it's like speaking. When we act, we simply act irrationally. We don't put a lot of thought into what we do, into the consequences of it, and certainly that becomes a problem then. And tonight we're going to be studying about Moses, where anger, I think, got the best of Moses, caused him to say some things he shouldn't have said, and caused him to act in a way that he shouldn't have acted. Normally, very rational man, but anger is certainly a powerful emotion. The second kind of introduction question that we have for Numbers 20 tonight is question 2 on your handout. Do cemeteries help to remind us of what's really important? And I think the answer to that is absolutely. I know personally, whenever I go out and just walk through a cemetery, even stand beside a cemetery, and you begin looking at all the different headstones, all of the numerous headstones that are present in a cemetery, and you even stop to think about probably some of those people who are buried in that cemetery. It's just a somber reminder of the reality of what's going to happen to us in this life and in this world. And I always say I don't mean to be grim about it, but the reality, the inevitable situation is that our lives are slowly winding down in this world. And so one day all of us are going to die. And when you step foot into a cemetery, you can't help, I think, but be reminded of that fact. And then, of course, the question becomes in our mind, well, what's going to happen then? After my life is over in this world, what's going to happen to me? What's going to be the fate that awaits me? And tonight we're going to read about the death of two very important people in the history of Israel. Miriam, who was, of course, the sister of Moses and Aaron. Then we're going to read about the death of Aaron himself, who was the high priest. And you go throughout the Bible, it doesn't matter what servant it is that we looked at, any great servant of God, all of them had to face the inevitable, and that is that one day we're going to depart from this life. So I invite you to take your Bibles and turn over with me to Numbers chapter 20. And we're going to start reading here in verse 1 and go through about verse 13. It says, Then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. And the people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, If only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought us into the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of grain, or figs, or vines, or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink. So Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of the meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its waters. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. This was the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them. Question number 3 on your handout, on your worksheet, is the question, who died in the wilderness of Zin? Of course, we just read that in verse 1 there of chapter 20. That was Miriam. As I mentioned before, Miriam was somebody who would have been very special to Moses and also to Aaron. That was their sister. And Miriam was a very important figure, not only to them, but really to all Israel. In Exodus 15, when we read about the song of Israel rejoicing over the defeat of the Egyptians, we read about Miriam, who was a prophetess among the women. She was a very important leader to the women among the children of Israel. And so she led them in this great song of victory over the enemies of Israel. You think about what she meant to Moses. Well, when Moses was just a baby, she of course was one of those who was responsible for saving his life, for setting up his mother to take care of him during that process. She was the one who reported to Pharaoh's daughter and went out and, of course, told her about her mother being able to take care of the child for her. And you look at her life, really, the only blemish that you see about in her life is there in Numbers chapter 12, whenever she criticized Moses because of his leadership. And it's just an important reminder for us. She was a faithful servant of God, but she wasn't without sin. And of course, there's no child of God, small or great, that is above or beyond sin or reproach in this life. Question number 4 on your handout. So what new problem did Moses and Aaron face? Well, it really wasn't a new problem in the sense that they had never faced it before. It was new in the sense that I think they hadn't dealt with it for a while, or at least as far as we know, they hadn't dealt with it for a while. And that was the problem of complaint. The children of Israel complained because there wasn't enough food to eat, and there wasn't enough water to drink for them, and of course for their animals and their livestock that they were taking care of. You kind of have a contrast throughout this 40 years of wandering in the wilderness between the children of Israel and Moses and Aaron. And basically what you see is whenever things got hard, when difficult things arose in life, when there were problems that had to be faced, the children of Israel always resorted to complaining. And so their idea of what to do in a difficult situation was to gripe and to complain and to murmur. And you can contrast that with Moses and Aaron. Well, what did they do whenever things got difficult? They always approached the Lord. And so you have this principle, what can difficulties do to us in this life? Well, they can either bring out the best in us, or they can bring out the worst in us. They can either cause us to become gripers and murmurers and complainers, or else they can cause us to become the type of people who draw closer and closer to God. Problems and difficulties can either mature us spiritually, or they can cause us to act like children. And so when you look at the children of Israel, it didn't do a lot for them. They chose to gripe and to complain and to act like, or to exhibit childish behavior whenever difficulties arose. You contrast that with Moses and Aaron. They came to God. They brought their problems and their difficulties to God. And they certainly became more mature spiritually as they went through these difficult times. Question number, it's number 6 on your handout. I'm skipping number 5 here, but number 6 on the handout. What did the quarreling people say to Moses? You read their response there in verses 3 through 5, and they basically blamed 2 different people. First of all, they blamed God. They said, well, it's God's fault that we don't have enough food or that we don't have enough water. And even some of them came to the point where they expressed that they desired to have perished with some of their brothers who died in that great rebellion. Remember, we studied in the rebellion of Korah and those 250 men and how they died, and what happened to them because of that. And a lot of these people said, well, we wish we'd died back there. We wish we died with them whenever they perished instead of having to face this great difficulty. So they blamed God. God was the source of their lack of water and lack of food. And then they also blamed Moses. They say, well, you're the one who brought us out of Egypt. When we were in Egypt, remember all the wonderful conditions that we experienced when we were in Egypt. Well, reality had been far removed, from the situation there in Egypt. And so they blamed Moses. He was the one who brought them into the wilderness. He's the one who had taken them out of Egypt. And you want to kind of stop here and think for a moment, what was really the cause of the difficulties that they were facing right then and there? Well, the reality was it wasn't God's fault. God wanted them to go into the promised land 40 years ago. But they refused to do that. And it may not have been them personally, but certainly their forefathers would have been responsible for rebelling and their unbelief against God. It wasn't God's fault that they weren't there. It wasn't Moses' fault. He did everything that he could as a leader to try to get them into the promised land. The reality of the situation was either, number one, these were still some of the people who had initially rebelled, or else their family members were some of those people who had initially rebelled against God. And a lot of times, whenever we try to face the reality of a situation, it's a lot easier just to blame somebody else for the problems that either we ourselves have caused, or maybe even our family members have caused difficulties for us. And rather than acknowledge that, we'd rather blame God or put the blame on somebody else. And so that was what Israel was doing here. Question number 7. So how does God say that he's going to resolve this water problem? Well, he told Moses to take his famous rod. Remember, this is the rod that was used in so many of the plagues of Egypt. Certainly in the most memorable, at least in my mind, is that of the crossing of the Red Sea. To take this rod, to gather all the people together, and to speak to a rock, and that rock, water would flow out of that rock and provide drink for not only the people, but also for their animals too. And so in question number 8, it says, what does Moses say to the people? You read about Moses doing what God commanded him to do, but he makes a important statement, one that we're going to talk about a little bit more as we go on here. But he made the statement whenever he gets before this rock to the children of Israel. Do we have to give you water out of this rock? And so I think that pronoun we is pretty important factor to what God, or to how God reacts to Moses and to some of the things that happened because of that. Question number 9, of course, we read about Moses striking that rock. Why do you think that Moses struck that rock? And this is kind of a personal idea or question here, but personally I think Moses let the unbelief of the people, and he let the griping and the complaining and the murmuring of the people get to him. Remember, we're reading here about this instance, and to us it's just a moment in time, but we're getting toward the end of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And so Moses, who was a very meek man, the Bible says, had to deal with these people, their unbelief, their griping, their complaining for 40 years. And I think it finally just got to him. I think he got to the point where he'd pent up all this frustration of dealing with his people for 40 years. And in one moment, he just let all of his emotions out. And he said some things and he did some things that he shouldn't have done. And of course, that moment of anger got the best of him and led to some serious consequences. Question number 10, so why was the Lord displeased with both Moses and Aaron? I wrote down 3 things here that really stand out to me in this story. Number 1, he spoke to the people and not the rock. God had told him to speak to the rock. He didn't really say anything about speaking to the people, but there's no indication in that story that Moses spoke to the rock. He spoke to the people instead. The second thing, we mentioned a couple questions before, but the pronoun we. He includes himself and Aaron in this act, this miraculous act and provision that God was giving to the children of Israel. And so if you think about it, he was kind of putting himself on the level of God. Now, think about this, somebody taking a staff and hitting this rock. He didn't say he was supposed to do that. He's supposed to speak to the rock. But think about somebody going out in the wilderness today, and they start talking to the rock, and then the rock starts gushing out water and provides enough water for 2 to 3 million people and all their animals. Well, that's nothing short of a miracle. And so for Moses to include himself in that idea that he and Aaron somehow contributed to this great miracle, that was something, of course, I think that God took personally and ultimately led to one of the consequences of Moses not entering the promised land. The third thing that I have here is I always found it interesting in this story that the Bible tells us that Moses strikes this rock, and he strikes it 2 times. And in verse 11 there of Numbers chapter 20, if it would have been just as easy to say, well, Moses struck the rock, but he struck the rock twice. And I always, when you guys study with me and we're looking at the Old Testament, I always love to look at the shadows and the types. And we know when we read 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 4, it talks about how all Israel drank of this spiritual rock. And this rock was a shadow of Christ. And so it was representative of this idea. It was a foreshadow of something greater to come, that whenever Christ was smitten, water freely flowed out of him. And that, of course, is the idea of spiritual waters, which is a tremendous theme emphasized time and time again in the scriptures. But when Christ died, when he was smitten, he gave life, spiritual life, to all the people. Well, how many times was Christ smitten? The Hebrew writer talks about how he only had to die once. He only was smitten once for our transgressions and our sins. And so to me, that's always been interesting, because if that rock was a type of Christ, then Moses, by hitting it twice, actually messed up the type or the shadow that God had in mind from this rock. We do know, though, that's just my personal opinion. I always say that when I go over that part of it. But to me, it's an interesting thought and an interesting study. We do know that God says he didn't obey him and he didn't honor him, both he and Aaron. And so God was displeased with them because of that. All right, let's look at verse 14 beginning here in Numbers chapter 20. It says, "Now Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel, you all know the hardships that has befallen us, how our fathers went down to Egypt, and we dwelt in Egypt a long time, and the Egyptians afflicted us and our fathers. When we cried out to the Lord, he heard our voice and sent the angel and brought us up out of Egypt. Now here we are in Kadesh, a city on the edge of your border. Please let us pass through your country. We will not pass through fields or vineyards, nor will we drink water from wells. We will go along the king's highway. We will not turn aside to the right hand or to the left until we have passed through your territory." Then Edom said to him, "You shall not pass through my land, lest I come out against you with the sword." So the children of Israel said to him, "We will go by the highway, and if I or my livestock drink any of your water, then I will pay for it. Let me only pass through on foot, nothing more." Then he said, "You shall not pass through." So Edom came out against them with many men and with a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory, so Israel turned aside from him. Question number 11 on your handout is, what message was sent to the king of Edom? Of course, that was the message that the children of Israel wanted to pass through the land of Edom on their way to the promised land. Now, if I had a map here tonight, I would show you, the easiest route for the children of Israel at this point into the promised land would have been to come up through the south on the west side of the Jordan River. That was the land of Edom. And so if they were going to do that, they had to get permission to go through that land. And so that's what Moses is asking for. He emphasizes, of course, in that request that they are brothers. The Edomites were descendants of Esau. Esau, of course, was a brother of Jacob, who we know was renamed Israel. And so these nations were very closely related. Moses appeals to that in his request. He says, listen, we're brothers here. We want to pass through your land in order to get to the land that God is going to give us. And of course, he emphasized in that request, he guaranteed that they weren't going to go through any of their vineyards, they weren't going to eat any of their crops, and they would only travel in plain sight. They'd only travel on the king's highway and keep from, dropping out of the side of that nation. Question number 12, so how does Edom respond? Well, they bluntly refused. They said, there's no way you guys we're going to allow you to pass through this land. And not only that, but they even threatened them with the idea of war. If you guys even think that you're going to come through here, we're going to come out here and we're going to fight against you. Now, we know that wasn't probably a smart thing to do. The children of Israel had just come up out of Egypt, and look what happened to the Egyptians. Anybody who had tried to oppose them thus far had met with a very dire fate. But also from a physical perspective, you have to think about the king of Edom. To have 2 to 3 million people and all their animals passing through your land, that would have been devastating if they'd stopped to eat or, taken your wells or anything like that, and just allowing them in your land themselves, was opening a door of opportunity. If they were going to try to conquer you, that would have been a very easy way for them to do such. And so, question 13, what does Moses ask Edom a second time? Well, he tries to, again, even though he was refused the first time, he tries once again to get the king of Edom to allow them to pass through their land. And he assures them, once again, they're going to travel in plain sight. He even says, if we drink any of your water, if any of our livestock turns aside and drinks any of your water, we'll gladly pay for that water. And he basically just wanted them to understand he didn't have any hidden plans or motives and didn't want anything from them. The only thing that they wanted to do was walk through their land in order to get where God was taking them. Question number 14, so how was Israel turned away from Edom? Well, after the second request, the king of Edom immediately mobilizes his army, which the Bible tells us was a very strong and powerful army, had a lot of men within it, and they marched out against Israel. And so basically Israel has to turn away and go another direction and escape the threat of this army of Edom coming out and fighting against them. And you have this principle, you think about it, God dealt with his people at times very, very severely. But when other people threatened his children, God took that very seriously. Look at the Egyptians. What happened whenever they took these people who were the apple of God's eye, his children, and they persecuted them? Well, he judged the whole nation. Whenever you read about these other nations that are coming out and they're going to attack Israel and fight against them, what does God do to them? Well, he utterly destroys them. And so the Edomites, they're on, I guess you could say they're on God's bad list. God's going to repay them for threatening his children. Time isn't now, though. God doesn't say you go in there and you march against them and destroy them, but eventually God does bring judgment upon the Edomites. You can read more about that in the book of Obadiah. So let's go to verse 22 here in Numbers chapter 20 and finish out the chapter. It says, now the children of Israel, the whole congregation, journeyed from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in Mount Hor by the border of the land of Edom, saying, Aaron shall be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land which I have given to the children of Israel, because you rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. Take Aaron and Eleazar his son, and bring them up to Mount Hor. And strip Aaron of his garments, and put them on Eleazar his son, for Aaron shall be gathered to his people, and die there. So Moses did just as the Lord commanded, and they went up to Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation. Moses stripped Aaron of his garments, and put them on Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there on the top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain. Now when all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, all the house of Israel mourned for Aaron 30 days. Question number 15 on your handout is, what did the Lord say to Moses and Aaron at Mount Hor? Well, God revealed to them that was the place where Aaron was going to die. There's a statement that's made, a pretty popular, reoccurring statement that's made throughout the Old Testament. Aaron was going to be gathered to his people. And you think about death and the way that God views death and the way that we view death, oftentimes difference between night and day. But when a faithful child of God dies, he's not alone. In fact, the Bible describes it as being gathered to his people, his own people. And of course, Jesus expressed that idea in the New Testament, those who were really his mother, those who were really his brethren. When we die and depart from this life as faithful Christians, we're going to our real family. We're going to eternity with our brothers and our sisters, all the children of God over the years, and of course to our true and spiritual Father, that is God himself. So very comforting statement that you read about there, but it wouldn't have lessened the physical pain of death any less for Moses. He also reemphasizes Aaron is not going to enter into the promised land because he had disobeyed God. And at the same time, God reveals unto them that there's to be a transfer of the office of the high priest. And so question number 16 is the question, who received Aaron's garments? Well, we just read there that was Eleazar, one of Aaron's sons. Even though, as we go through life, we talked about the reality of death. It's going to come to every faithful servant of God. Even though we have to bury the workers of God, the work of God still has to go on. And so just because Aaron, one of God's great workers, has departed from this life doesn't mean that there's suddenly nothing left to do. The work of God has to go on. That work of the high priest is transferred to Eleazar, one of his sons. And then question 17 is, who died on Mount Or? And we talked about that already. That, of course, was Aaron. You know, Aaron was the first high priest under the law of Moses. And when you think about the first of anything is always memorable. It's always special. And so Aaron, because he was the first high priest, that stands out in my memory. When we talk about the high priesthood, that's one of the first people that pop into my mind. He was 123 years old, the Bible says, whenever he died. He walked with God. That doesn't mean he was perfect. You know, sometimes we read about Aaron, he failed pretty seriously. He was the one who made the golden calf for the children of Israel to worship. He joined in the rebellion against Moses in Numbers chapter 12 with Miriam, his sister. But he persevered to the end, and he died a faithful servant of God. And I think sometimes we often lose sight of that. You know, you think about, for instance, the life of David. We think about the horrible things that he did, murder, adultery, but that wasn't really a complete picture of the life of David. And likewise, when you think about Aaron, you know, sometimes we think about, well, Aaron made this golden calf. Aaron rebelled against Moses, but that wasn't really a complete picture of the life that Aaron lived here upon this earth. He was weak, yeah. He had his weaknesses. He sinned from time to time, but overall, he was a faithful servant of God. And that's certainly a comfort to me whenever I think about the life that I lived here upon this earth, and your lives too. How our mistakes don't always define or make the complete picture of the life that we've lived here upon this earth. Well, I hope this study has been beneficial to you. Don't know whenever we'll be able to get back in public gathering again, but I certainly look forward to that time. And until then, we're going to continue these studies. Hope you can join in, and hope they are certainly worth your time and your effort and all of us growing in God's Word together.